Hello. How many is that? Okay. Do we think it's ready to start yet? Do we got enough people online? I think so. What's the time? I can't see the number of participants.
It's at the bottom. It says 340.
340. Okay. I've got mine on a minimized screen because so I can see my script. 340. Should we get going or wait a little bit longer? Wait till we hit 500? Yes. Okay. Just to let people who are joining us know, we're just waiting for people to come in. We're up to about 300-400. We'll wait for a little bit more. We've got over 1,400 who've registered an interest. So we want to give people time to join. It just takes a little bit. And we'll get going in a minute or so. Everyone's here and present. So the technology is working fine at the moment as well. So. What are we up to now?
390, just a little under.
Okay.
But I think we can start.
So otherwise we'll be waiting. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's Hugh Lanning, and on behalf of Labour and Palestine, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. At the last count, as I said, we had over 1,400 people who registered an interest, and hopefully everyone will be able to participate. That was my phone. Apologies for that. So tonight's event, Justice for Palestine, is a conversation between Jeremy Corbyn and Mustafa Barghouti. And Jeremy and Mustafa are going to be discussing the need for a progressive response from the global community in face of the ever-mounting threats faced by Palestine. But we're very pleased as well that joining us tonight to facilitate the event is Diana Bhutto, who many of you will know. She's been a long, fierce campaigner on behalf of Palestine. She's a Palestinian Canadian and a lawyer specializing in international and human rights law. And she's going to be in charge tonight once I hand over to her. But before handing over to Diana, just and for her to get the event underway and to introduce our guest, just a few words. First, thanks to Jeremy and Mustafa and Diana for agreeing to participate tonight in this Labour and Palestine event. We hope the format of tonight's event, a conversation, will enable us to explore the issues in a bit more detail than maybe we are able to normally if you have a rally or another type of event. I also want to thank Arise and Matt and his team of volunteers who are helping to link and stream the event tonight, which hopefully will all go smoothly. And just a few words about Labour and Palestine. Labour and Palestine was set up and established at the Labour Party conference in 2018 and is sponsored by 7 major trade unions who are affiliated to the Labour Party. And its sole purpose, it has only one aim really, which is to generate and galvanise support for Palestine at grassroots level within the Labour Party. And so far, we're doing well. We've now got over 10,000 party members on our database. And if you do not receive our mailings, and if you're a party member or not, if you'd like to keep in touch and get information about future events, you can go to our website, which is imaginatively titled www.labourandpalestine.org.uk. So tonight's event is designed to help and inform and support party members in raising the issue of Palestine in your branches and constituencies. And now that live online meetings are resuming within the party, we're hoping that one of the results of tonight's meeting will be that Palestine is on the agenda up and down the country at party meetings. Once this is over next week, we'll be issuing a briefing to all our contacts in over 500 constituencies on Palestine to help you in raising the issue. So whether you're a party member or not, I'm sure tonight's event will be fascinating, helping us develop the sort of response that's needed in this country and globally to obtain justice for Palestine. Thank you once again. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and thank you for inviting me to facilitate what I think is going to be a really wonderful and lively discussion. Both of these individuals are individuals I've long admired. I admire their work and admire their commitment to Palestine. So this is an absolute delight to be with you today. In terms of the format, we are going to have, I'm hoping, 5 segments. I'm hoping that we will be able to speak to a number of issues today. I'm hoping we'll be able to touch on annexation, the global response to annexation, the growing inequality inside Israel, the attempts to undermine Palestine activism and criticism of Israel, and so much more. So in order to begin, I'm going to say, but both these individuals do not need any introductions. So I'm going to skip over that part and instead give a little bit of a background in terms of where it is that we are right now in this, when it comes to the issue of Palestine. Last month, we saw that both the UAE and Bahrain both broke with the longstanding Arab League decision not to have any relations with Israel until freedom for Palestinians was secured. In announcing its decision, the UAE indicated that part of the reason that it was normalizing relations with Israel was this attempt that it was going to somehow stop annexation. At the same time, in fact, on the same day, we heard Netanyahu come out to indicate that annexation is going to proceed ahead as normal. And in fact, the agreements that were signed made no mention whatsoever of stopping annexation. We've also, over the course of the past month, been hearing calls for new Palestinian elections, whether those are general elections, presidential elections, and PLO elections. And at the same time, we've been seeing that inside Israel, there's been a growing protest movement that is largely confined to the issues of Netanyahu's corruption and mismanagement of the response to the pandemic, but leaving behind or leaving unaddressed the issue of Palestinians and Palestinian rights, and of course, leaving unaddressed the issue of annexation. So I want to begin the first segment today, and I want to begin with you, Dr. Barghouti, to ask about what's going on currently when it comes to in Palestine. Has annexation been stopped as a result of this UAE deal? And what is it that we should be doing if in fact annexation, this threat of annexation is still looming? So you are muted, Dr. Barghouti, if you can unmute.
Thank you. I was muted. Okay. You can hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Good. Thank you, Diana. It's good to see you. And I want to thank Labour for Palestine for giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak. And I want to thank, I want to start by thanking Jeremy Corbyn for everything he has done, for his courage. He's a friend since long time, but I want to thank him for his courage, for his commitment to his principles. And I think the fact that he did not win elections was a loss to Britain, not to him. And I'm very proud to be with him on this panel. Actually, in response to your question, I do not think that these new agreements between Israel and Arab Emirates and Bahrain stopped annexation, but on the contrary, they have encouraged annexations. And it is very clear, as you said, Netanyahu announced on the same day of the declaration of these agreements that he's proceeding with annexation. He even upscaled his demand by saying that he will impose the Israeli law on the whole of the West Bank, not even parts of it. And in addition to that, Friedman, the American ambassador to Israel, clearly said in front of Trump and in front of the media that annexation is not stopped and is not canceled, it is just postponed. More than that, the Israeli measures on the ground, including the most recent decision of the Israeli government of establishing 5,400 more illegal settlement units in the West Bank, is an indication that practically annexation is happening. It's a creeping annexation that is going on. The Emirates and Bahrain cannot claim that they have stopped anything, since they actually created normalization with Israel after it has annexed East Jerusalem illegally, and the Golan Heights also illegally against international law. And in reality, what we see today is actually an increase in the support in Israel of the most right-wing fascist party, which is Naftali Bennett party, which is even more extreme than Netanyahu, which wants to annex the whole of the West Bank. And that group in the last elections had 6 seats. Now, thanks to the Emirates and Bahrain, they're going to have 24 seats in any future elections. So I think this is a clear enough indication that these new agreements are not about peace. They have not helped peace. And let me allow me here to say that what we witness on the ground here is a very serious movement from the side of the Israeli government and the Israeli Zionist movement of sending a message to Palestinians that no more they need to have a cover-up of their real intentions. They're not interested anymore in a compromise. They're not interested anymore in the so-called two-state solution. What they want is to impose Israeli rule on the West Bank in a system of apartheid. The American deal, the Trump's deal, the so-called the deal of the century, which, and I think it should be called the deceit of the century, is nothing but a plan to liquidate the Palestinian rights, to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian real independent state, to allow Israel officially to annex no less than 30% of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley, and then the Israeli illegal settlements, and practically open the road for annexing no less than 62% of West Bank. The American plan is a plan to liquidate Palestinian rights, including the rights of Palestinian refugees, and its other part is about normalizing relations with Arab countries or other countries in the world at the expense of the Palestinian people. So all in all, what we face here is a transformation, a major transformation of Israeli illegal occupation, which has become the longest occupation in modern history, into a system of racial discrimination and apartheid against the Palestinian people.
And so I want to turn to you, Jeremy, to ask the question about what the UK response should be, or how we should be responding globally to what continues to be a threat of annexation. This is no longer, or actually, as Dr. Mustafa said, it's no longer even a threat, but it's actually the continued creeping annexation, the attempt to liquidate Palestinian rights and to transform us into just a minority like other minorities within the Arab Middle East. So what is it that the international response should, or the UK response should be to this threat of annexation?
Diana, first of all, thank you very much for hosting this event, and thank you for inviting me on it. And it's an absolute pleasure to be on this with Mustafa, with Hugh, and with a wonderful team in Labour for Palestine, because they've done great work for a very long time in raising the issue of Palestine. And I thank Mustafa for his very kind remarks at the beginning. The annexation plan was proposed by Donald Trump, and I suspect quite a lot of it was actually, in a sense, just kite flying, send out this plan to annex the whole of the West Bank. That then provoked quite a lot of opposition all around the world. And the alleged pausing of the annexation plan after the arrangement was made with Bahrain and UAE is undermined completely by Benjamin Netanyahu's own statement that the annexation is going to go ahead at some point, possibly in the fairly near future. And I find it beyond disappointing that the UAE and Bahrain should make an agreement to normalize relations with Israel whilst seeking no protection whatsoever for the Palestinian people who've lost land because of settlements, the continuing occupation of the West Bank, and indeed the annexation of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. And so the reaction around the world to annexation has been quite strong. There's been a statement made by politicians all across Europe against the annexation, and a number of MPs, a very large number of MPs of all parties in the British Parliament have signed statements against it. And so if that succeeds in stopping the annexation, that doesn't end the problem of the occupation of the West Bank, because in reality, there are, what, 600,000 settlers living on the West Bank in at least 150 different settlements. In effect, those have been annexed into Israel already, in the sense that the Israeli army goes to support them, and they are able to sell their goods through the Israeli market. And so I would want the British government to say, no way do we support the annexation of the West Bank. We demand the end of the occupation, the end of the encirclement, effectively the siege of Gaza, and an end to the trade in settlement goods around the world, as is made very clear by the EU trade agreement with Israel. Because the one thing that Trump's plan has done is brought some attention around the world to all of this. And that is the only positive that's come out of it, in the sense that a lot of people have suddenly woken up to what the reality of the occupation actually is. I would want the British government to be much, much stronger than it is. And indeed, I propose that my party fully recognize the state of Palestine with ambassadorial links and full recognition in every way, as many countries around the world have. And that was agreed by the Labour Party conference. And I am very happy that we have that as our policy. And I want that policy to remain, because peace in the Middle East will only come through full recognition of the rights of Palestinian people.
Thank you very much. So I want to just very quickly say that it's a delight to see there are about 1,600 people who are joining us from, whether it's online or on Facebook and in other platforms. So thank you for all the hard work that you've done to put this event together. And I'm so delighted to see that there's so many high numbers. I want to pick up from that, Jeremy, and just press a little further and say, so what should the international response be? How is it that progressives should be looking not only to the issue of annexation, but also beyond? How is it that we should be pressing for an end to the occupation? What weight should be given to international law, particularly given that it's being undermined by Trump and by other governments? What is it that we should be doing internationally and not just within the UK?
First of all, understand that occupation is an easy word, and it's thrown around all the time. The reality of occupation means there are soldiers outside people's houses all the time. It means that children are taken in and imprisoned. And indeed, this afternoon, I was reading the testimony of a 17-year-old boy who was arrested whilst there was some incident going on, was denied any legal representation, was held without sufficient food or water, was interrogated, was badly beaten by soldiers, was put through a quasi-legal process, and then offered some kind of plea bargain as a way of eventually getting out of this arrest and imprisonment. And remember, he's a juvenile, he's under 18, and then he was finally, in his case, luckily released 2 months later in a terrible state of shock, and is clearly suffering from post-traumatic stress. The use of military courts, the imprisonment of children, is completely out with the Fourth Geneva Convention made in Geneva in 1949. And since the 1967 war, 800,000 Palestinian people have been held at various times in Israeli jails. And 95% of all people arrested during the occupation are found guilty by the courts concerned. And so the reality of occupation has to come home to people. And anyone that lives in Palestine, a Palestinian person, becomes accustomed to the idea of roadblocks, checks and searches, I suppose, in a horrible kind of way. Anyone like me visiting is totally shocked by the idea. You go a few kilometers down the road and there's a checkpoint, there's a checkpoint, there's a checkpoint the whole time. That's what it's like. That's what occupation is. So first of all, it's illegal within the Geneva Convention. Secondly, it's been condemned by the UN, by Security Council, by General Assembly, and it's been condemned universally. And thirdly, if we're trading in goods coming from the occupation, coming from the settlements, settlements that have been set up there, then we're actually conniving in the illegal exploitation of the land of Palestine. And so I think it is an economic issue as well as a diplomatic one. And I think the principle of recognition of Palestine is a very important one. And it's also a demand that Palestine be allowed to trade properly on the international market, because it's very easy to strangle an economy if you control the access points, if you control the way that people move. And so Gaza, for example, produces wonderful strawberries. It's very easy to wreck a strawberry crop just by making it sit in a truck for a few days at a frontier point. And so it is all that is illegal about it. And the world ought to be stronger in condemning it, and the UN much stronger on this. But Trump comes up with a plan, and Netanyahu welcomed this plan and accepted it. And whilst it has allegedly been put on hold, I think it should be abandoned altogether, and the pressure should be kept up to end the occupation and the settlement policy.
So I want to, Dr. Mustafa, I want to pick up on this a little bit. It's what I hear him saying is that there's a question of recognition and then also stopping the settlement goods. Do you agree? Should there be more? Should we be expanding beyond that? Are those tools that can be effective?
They are useful, and but let me just elaborate on something. I think the worst form of oppression in the world is when the oppression itself is denied. And that is exactly the situation we live in today. Because so many countries in the world avoid the word occupation, and the United States does not recognize that there is occupation. Israel claims there is no occupation. And the other very bad thing is that the oppressed is denied the right to resist occupation. I will explain later how we are described when we try to resist this terrible oppression, but including the oppression of children that was very well described by Jeremy. But in reality, Israel has been allowed, increasingly allowed, to be above the law, above international law. Israel does not recognize occupation and does not recognize the existence of occupation, and thus does not recognize the application of Geneva Conventions at all. And Israel was allowed to be above the law and completely impunitive to international law. And I believe that there are several things that has to be done here. First of all, Israel has to be accountable to law. And in that sense, our cause has been brought to the International Criminal Court. As you know, that now the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is subjected to punitive acts from the side of Mr. Trump and his administration. And I think the main reason for that is because they are investigating the possibility of investigating war crimes committed by Israel in Gaza and in the West Bank. The International Court of Justice is an important one. They have issued very important advisory opinion to the United Nations, which was never followed up. And that opinion said that all settlements are illegal and that annexation of Jerusalem is illegal and the building of a segregation wall or the apartheid wall was illegal and should be removed. But there was no follow-up on this matter by United Nations or by anybody else. In my opinion, at the level of, at the legal level, two things should happen. Israel must be judged at the International Criminal Court for the war crimes it is committing. But also, I think there should be legal cases in different courts of the world against the Israeli violations, including against those citizens who have dual citizenship, and practice settlements in the occupied territories, and thus be participating in committing war crime. These things have to happen. But in my opinion, the main international tool that can really affect the situation and that can really influence Israel is the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaigns. Exactly like the apartheid system was treated in South Africa, Israeli apartheid system has to be treated. And it is no more just an occupation. It is a system of racial discrimination that affects every aspect of our life. And it is affecting not only Palestinians in the occupied territories, but Palestinian refugees that are prohibited from going home or coming back home. It is affecting the Palestinians who live inside Israel itself. That racial discriminatory system has to be stopped. And I think boycott, divestment, sanctions is very important. If somebody does not want to sanction Israel, they can at least sanction the settlements. And the Human Rights Council of the United Nations have issued already a list of companies and structures that work in settlements illegally. Companies like Bank Abu Alim or other Israeli banks, or some even foreign companies, all of them have to be boycotted if we want to apply international law. Of course, recognition of Palestine is important. And it is very strange that many European countries like Britain and France and Spain and Italy continue to claim that they are supporting two-state solution, yet they recognize Israel fully and abstain from recognizing Palestine, even when Palestine as an idea of a state is being demolished on a daily basis by the Israeli side and by plans like the ones that Trump is proposing. So in my opinion, the international community has to react much stronger to the Israeli violations and Israeli crimes in the Palestinian occupied territories. And I think a major issue here, and this is my suggestion to the people who are in solidarity with Palestine, don't be defensive. Don't let the Israeli lobby stop you. Don't let them terrorize you. Because in my opinion, what Israel is doing to the very noble movement of boycott, divestment, sanctions, which is a peaceful movement for the human rights of Palestinian people, what they are doing to it is nothing but an act and a system of psychological terror. They try to use that against politicians. They used it against Labour Party. We know that in Britain. And that act of psychological terror should not be accepted. And that's why one should not be defensive. On the contrary, Israel must be on the defensive side because it is the one that is committing crimes against the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this point because it's very important. and focus a little bit on some of the Israeli tactics that are being used. We see that the Israeli government is constantly, and of course with the help of its allies, trying to undermine and criticize supporters of Palestine internationally. It's tried to demonize the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. It's put pressure on international governments to make sure that any organizations that support BDS get their funding cut. We've also seen that there's this growing movement to try to condemn anybody who criticizes Israel in any way. How do you think, and I'm going to ask you, Jeremy, this, and then I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Mustafa, how do you think that political parties and organizations, particularly progressive and democratic ones, should be responding to these Israeli tactics and to these Israeli threats, particularly given that Dr. Mustafa says that we shouldn't be on the defensive?
I think political parties, my own particularly, should always form its policy decisions on the basis of principles. The principles of human rights, the principles of the Universal Declaration, in the British case, the principles of the European Convention, and adherence to international law, such as the Rome Convention, which set up the International Criminal Court, such as the International Court of Justice, and of course, the Geneva Conventions of 1949. And when you form those things together, you then see what the effect of the occupation is on the people of Palestine and the illegality of it. The European Union has made it very, very clear that the sale of settlement goods within the European Union is illegal because they've been illegally taken from occupied land. They've made the same decision with other places that are under some form of occupation. I think it's very important to put those principles at the heart of it. What's very interesting is that the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council, has decided to name a number of companies that have been involved in the settlement policy, that have been involved in the occupation, and name them. The British government said they should not be named, it should only be states that are named. Well, in that case, they could blame the Israeli government for the occupation, and they could, of course, vote to fully recognize Palestine. But I think it's an interesting recognition by the UN of the role that particular individual companies play in this, and the way in which the US administration uses the Helms-Burton law to prosecute any company that trades with a place that the US doesn't like, such as Cuba, for example, and use that against that individual company, and indeed threaten companies in other countries. And so the US tentacles reach out a very, very long way on this. And it also includes the cuts in the funding to the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which is absolutely crucial for the education, health, and indeed survival of so many Palestinian people. Now, some of that cut in funding has been made up by other countries' donations, but much not. And I was in refugee camps in Jordan a couple of years ago. I was talking to head teachers of schools who were terrified of what was going to happen to their funding in the future. And so it is important that you form your policies around that. But it's also, I think, important to recognize that whilst we are very critical for the state of Israel for its behavior towards Palestine and the occupation, we should also recognize that there are people in Israel that also think the occupation is wrong, that do demonstrate against that occupation and do speak out against it. And indeed, I was recently on a call with people in both Israel and in Ramallah that were both condemning the occupation and condemning the annexation strategy. But it's gone on for a very long time. Generation after generation of Palestinian youngsters on the West Bank and in Gaza have only ever known a life under occupation. That is simply wrong.
Yeah, Dr. Mustafa, how should people be responding to these Israeli tactics, particularly progressive movements? Is it easier said than done?
Well, I know it's not easy, and I know there is a political cost to taking the principled stand here. We all recognize that, and that's why we appreciate those who are in solidarity with Palestine so much. We know that they will be subjected to pressures and to nasty things. It's very well known. But it is important also to explain the reality to the people. In my opinion, everything starts with knowing the right narrative. And the major problem here is that the Israeli narrative is dominating most of the major media outlets. And that's why I think one very important step is to explain what is the reality here, and also to explain the Israeli tactics. The fact that any kind of resistance by Palestinians, military resistance, was described as terror, while Israeli military violence against Palestinians is described as legal. Palestinian non-violent resistance is frequently described as violent, which is not true. Even when we resist with words, with very peaceful demonstrations, we are accused of being instigators. And those in solidarity with Palestine are frequently described as anti-Semitic. And finally, those wonderful and noble Jewish people that Jeremy spoke about, who stand up to support Palestinian rights, are frequently described as self-hating Jews. It doesn't end. What we face here is a very malignant system that tries to prevent anybody from freely expressing their views, and that tries to prohibit the knowledge about the reality to reach people. And the most recent, really astonishing claim, we heard it from Netanyahu. He said that if you ask to remove the Israeli illegal settlers who are violating international law by settling on occupied Palestinian land, according to UN resolutions, if you want to remove these settlers, you are actually conducting ethnic cleansing. I mean, imagine, it's reversing the reality. The Palestinians who are the victims are becoming the aggressors, and the Israelis who are the aggressive part, those who are occupying our land, those who conducted the largest ethnic cleansing against Palestinians in 1948, become the victim. So the narrative is very important. And again, I want to repeat, one should not be defensive. One should really be strong, and being defensive means that you would lose the battle before you start it. But one more thing, I think what we lack as Palestinians, and what we need more from those friends who are in solidarity with Palestine, because they are in solidarity with the principles of human rights and respect to international law. What we need more is organization and good media. I think Virginia Woolf said something like, nothing has happened till it's been described. And in the knowledge and minds of many people, nothing is happening in Palestine unless it is really described well in a systematic manner. And that's why I think we should combine good media work, good information strategy, and boycott BDS campaign all together. We should combine all of that together to stand up to this unacceptable level of oppression and violation of human rights.
Absolutely. The whole issue is the principles on which we operate. We are all on this call completely anti-racist people. We're opposed to anti-Semitism. We're opposed to any form of racism. I recognize that there are many people in Israel who believe profoundly that the occupation is wrong and that they ought to be able to have a normal relationship with people. But you will only achieve that by the end of the occupation and a complete removal of the threat of annexation of the West Bank. Israel did withdraw its settlements in Gaza, and in return then placed Gaza under siege, where it's been ever since that time. And so Netanyahu's argument that it's impossible to remove settlements is removed by his own actions and the actions of his predecessors. Quite simply, anyone who's seen the settlements and seen the settlement roads and seen the effect on the Palestinian economy and the construction of the wall, the separation barrier, will realize exactly what occupation looks like. Surely to goodness, we should be in full recognition of the state of Palestine and its right to trade normally around the world, and the right of its people to be able to freely move about and travel, which they cannot at the present time. Those surely are basic requirements, which is why I was very pleased when our party did agree to full recognition of the state of Palestine, and that was included in our manifesto on which we fought the last general election.
Then I want to give just a couple of examples for people to know what we are talking about. I mean, I think not so many people know that the major highways in the West Bank, which is occupied territory and which is Palestinian land, the major highways in the West Bank are exclusive for Israelis. If I or any other Palestinian dare to walk or drive on these major roads, we can be put in jail for 6 months. It's the worst form of segregation. It never happened even in South Africa. A few people know that a Palestinian on average in the West Bank is allowed to use no more than 50 cubic meters of water per year, while an illegal settler is allowed to use 2,400 cubic meters from the water sources of the Palestinians in the West Bank. Few people know that 44% of all Palestinian adults, men, have been in jail. And few people know that Israel continues to use the law that was abolished in Britain, which is the British emergency law, that allows Israel to arrest people under what they call administrative detention, which means anybody can be arrested for unlimited period of time and for repeated arrests without charges. Without charges. We have people who have been in jail for 8 years without being charged. I think if these things get to be known by the people, if they know about how children are treated in Hebron, if they see what is the real image of the situation and the life in Hebron, where roads are segregated, where whole neighborhoods are closed down, where more than 25,000 Palestinians are subjected to continuous oppression for the sake of 400 illegal Israeli settlers in the city. I think that would be enough to make people understand and make them also participate in any kind of activity to stop this system of oppression.
Can I give an example of this and how terrifying it is for Palestinian people? Some years ago, I was in East Jerusalem and I went to what was going to become the city of David. And I asked the people that were taking me around why there were enormous numbers painted on the houses that didn't seem to bear any relation to the street name, the street number, or anything else. And they told me that was to identify the order in which they were going to be demolished. These are Palestinian people's homes. And it was being identified as to how they would be demolished to make way for a very large settlement that was due to be built. And for people in the UK watching this discussion we're having this evening, in reality, for Palestinian people under occupation, habeas corpus doesn't really exist. In British law, you cannot arrest somebody and keep them indefinitely in prison without bringing them to court or bringing a charge against them or releasing them. That surely is how it ought to be everywhere. It's not. And the figures that Mustafa gave are correct of the number of Palestinians that have been in prison. And the number I gave of the total, the aggregate number since 1967, we're looking towards almost 1 million people that have been in prison at some point during the period of the occupation. And so the function of this call, this discussion, is to inform our audience and to build up that sense of international solidarity to end the occupation, which is the basis on which we can bring about peace for the future. When peaceful, nonviolent protest is oppressed then that leads on to something else. I don't want to see any violence. I don't want to see any shooting. I don't want to see any bombing. I don't want to see any rockets. I want to see people being able to live in peace. That means the freedom to live their lives as they wish to, and the freedom of that expression. They don't have it. Last point, I just remember, I went to monitor elections. I've been to Palestine and Israel a number of times. And I remember monitoring an election in which Mustafa was a candidate. He was being stopped at a checkpoint and held in a most humiliating way. And he was obviously extremely well known, obviously going about his business as an election candidate, wishing to talk to potential voters, which is what election candidates do. And he was being deliberately humiliated in front of the people that he was seeking support from. That's what occupation looks like.
Indeed, and here we are. I mean, I think I'd be remiss in saying, if I didn't say, Dr. Barghouti I've long admired his work. He's long been somebody I look up to, lives only 2 hours away from me. And there's no way that he could ever visit me in the city of Haifa because he would never be able to get a permit to come and see me here. And so this is the reality of occupation, where you have people who are in the same country, in the same space, living under the same regime, and denied the ability to visit one another, not because of the pandemic, but because of a regime that is in place. I want to just in the interest of sorry, I muted myself. I want to just in the interest of time, maybe look a little bit forward and ask the questions. What do you think the priorities should be over the coming period in terms of winning justice for Palestine? Dr. Barghouti, what do you think that the priorities should be? Where should we be focusing our energies in Palestine and internationally?
Well, thank you for this question. I first of all want to emphasize one point, which is that we truly live not only under a system of occupation, but increasingly in a system of apartheid and severe racial discrimination. And when we speak about finding a new way out of this situation, we are not only speaking about the interest of Palestinians, but in the long run, actually, we are speaking about the interest of Israelis themselves. As I told many Israelis, sometimes soldiers who were beating us or arresting us, that I frequently told them, I struggle not only for ourselves, but for you, for your future, because it is unacceptable. It is unacceptable that you can live with the fact that you are an apartheid system. All in all, I think we are suffering a lot today because there is a very serious imbalance of power between us and the Israeli oppressive regime. And that lack of balance has led Israel to increasingly being more aggressive against Palestinians. And I think this cannot be changed, and nothing can be changed unless we change the balance of power between us and Israel. And for that, we have invented a strategy that is now put for discussion among all Palestinians. And I'm so glad actually to say that so many other Palestinian groups have actually gradually adopted the pillars of this strategy. And that took a lot of discussion, but also a lot of showing good models of how the struggle should be. And I think that we can change the balance of power through popular nonviolent resistance. We have just reached a very important historic agreement between all Palestinian groups, all political parties, including Hamas, including Fatah, including our movement, the Palestinian Initiative, and PFLP, and everybody else, that the main form of struggle that we should follow is peaceful, popular, nonviolent resistance. That is one important pillar of our struggle. The second one is definitely BDS, because without an international movement that supports Palestinian struggle and that effectively can materially change the situation, we cannot succeed. And that's why in parallel to popular resistance, we need strong boycott, divestment sanctions against Israeli occupation and against Israeli apartheid. And it should be clear that this is not, BDS is not against Israeli people or Jewish people in any way. It's against Israeli occupation and against the system of apartheid that it created. The third point is internal Palestinian unity. It's very important that we get unified. And now we are engaging all in a very strong action of trying to have a unified front and unified position. And we are trying to bring back what we have lost, which is our internal Palestinian democracy. Palestinians are not saints, and there is a certain number of mistakes that Palestinian leaders have done, including abolishing the democratic system. And that's why we believe that unity has to be based on democracy, and that Palestinians should be giving back their right to have democratic free elections, although we know that Israel will do everything it can to prevent such elections from taking place. Finally, there are two more points. One is that we need to reconnect Palestinians everywhere together. We've lost that because of Oslo Agreement. And you know very well that I have been in opposition to this agreement, mainly because it allowed the world to think that there is peace while Israel continued to build illegal settlements. And the number of settlers have increased from 110,000 when Oslo Agreement was signed to more than 750,000 today. So what we need is to bring back Palestinians together, Palestinians in the diaspora, Palestinians in the occupied territories, and Palestinians in Israel itself, to jointly have a common struggle for freedom and for equality. And finally, the sixth pillar of what we are proposing is to create a joint struggle between us and Jewish people who are against occupation and who are against apartheid. And there is an increasing number of those, especially young Jewish people, mainly, unfortunately, in other countries, including the United States, who are increasingly getting convinced that what is happening is not in the interest of their people, and that it is so shameful to have a system of apartheid in the 21st century. So I think these six pillars is what we have to deal with and work with to change the balance of power. And only after we change the balance of power, we can change the situation. I do not think that negotiations when you are very weak will bring anything. And the Israelis know that very well, although Palestinians have always wanted to be negotiating, and it is always Netanyahu who blocked any possibility of negotiations.
I think that what Mustafa said is actually very hopeful, because through his work, he has managed to unite a very large proportion of Palestinian political opinion and society. And the commitment to nonviolent direct action is a very, very important one, particularly with all the parties signing up to it, because we have to recognize the illegality and the injustice of the occupation and the settlement policy, but also recognize that the understanding of what it means has got to be got out around the rest of the world so that we understand the reality of it. I've just finished reading a book that I found incredibly powerful, Against a Loveless World by Susan Abulhalwa, who lives in the United States. It's not an easy read. In fact, I found some of it extremely difficult to read because of the brutality that it described of the situation that she was in. A young woman born in a refugee camp after the Six-Day War in 1967, describes her life in Kuwait, in Jordan, and in Palestine, and in prison in Israel. And it brings home to people the numbers of Palestinians who are still in refugee camps. I've been to refugee camps in Lebanon and talked to Palestinians whose whole life has been in those refugee camps. I've talked to the grandchildren of refugees in refugee camps in Jordan. They are part of the 65 million refugees around the world at the present time. All people wanting to live their life and make their contribution to our world, but denied it. The prize of peace, the prize of recognition, the prize of the right of people to live their lives and not be refugees in their own country and not be subject to arbitrary arrest, imprisonment, is something that we should all be striving for. And the point that Mustafa was making about the growing numbers of people around the world who recognize that if you work on the principles of human rights and justice, you work on the principles of what international law is saying and should be saying, and the principles on which the UN General Assembly and Security Council, as well as the many UN agencies, have made decisions on this subject is about. Surely it's that strength that we've got to bring forward. And so I hope that particularly in the United States, there is a growing movement that will recognize the illegality and injustice of the occupation and the way that peace will best come by recognizing the rights and needs and justice of Palestinian people and not allow these companies that exploit the occupation for their own benefit. And the sanctions that are proposed to end the occupation are a very important way forward. And that is exactly what the decision the European Union has come to as well. And it's certainly a message that we all want to convey. And I hope on this call, many people have learned a lot from the very wise words of Dr. Barghouti. I've certainly always learned a lot from Dr. Barghouti whenever I've had the pleasure of his company.
And wise words from you too. Thank you very much. I want to end by perhaps asking very quickly the question about the elephant in the room. We're less than 30 days away from the US election. What do you think will happen if Biden is elected? Will it be any different? And what do you think will happen if Trump is re-elected? So I'll leave that open to either one of you to begin. Don't both jump in at once.
We're both looking for the unmute button, I think. And I think I found it first. Well, I would hope that Joe Biden, if he wins the election, would recognize that many people who presumably will be voting for him also voted for Bernie Sanders in the primaries, and that they heard the words of Bernie Sanders about recognition, and they heard the words that Bernie Sanders put about arms sales and what those arms are used for. And that Joe Biden would recognize there is a growing movement in the United States of not just young people, but older people as well. And it is people who are Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Christian or people of no faith whatsoever who want to see a decent future for all Palestinian people. And I hope Joe Biden would recognize that. Now, I hope he wants to bring the United States back into the orbit of international law. I would like to think, I don't know if he will, that the US would sign up for the International Criminal Court and that the US would start refunding UNRWA and refunding UNESCO and not have this sort of anti-international stuff that Trump has been promoting for the last few years. But you know what, in politics, it's not that much about what the individual politician says or does when they're in a position to say or do something. It's the pressures they're put under and the voices that are raised. So those voices of people around the world that want peace and justice, want human rights, want to see refugees treated properly, want to protect our natural world and environment. It's people being out there saying it and doing it that changes the whole political discourse. And believe you me, I'm very well aware of how quickly the mainstream media can be very critical of people who take a course of action that is not in line with what the establishment wants or predicts. When you take a course of action that's not in line with what the establishment wants or predicts, and they condemn you for it, do you know what? You know you're doing the right thing.
Absolutely.
I want to add a few words here. I think I'm still astonished up till now how a country like the United States could elect a person like Donald Trump. And if they re-elect him really again, this would be a disaster to the United States, to the whole world, and to peace in this world. And that's why I think it would be much better if Biden is elected. But when it comes to the Palestinian issue, and I have to be completely frank here, we've learned from our very painful experiences of waiting for others to do things for us, whether it's an Arab country or the United States or whoever. We've learned the very painful lesson of having to concentrate on self-reliance and self-organization. And I think what will determine the future here in this land is the struggle we will conduct on the ground here and in defending our rights. This is the most decisive element. We're very worried because Biden said he will not take back the American embassy from Jerusalem, and thus he will recognize practically the annexation of East Jerusalem. Of course, he will bring back support maybe to UNRWA and to the Palestinian Authority. But what I think must be clear, and I agree with Jeremy here, that you have to influence the politicians by clarifying to them the real risks of the wrong path. And here I want to be very clear. I want everybody in this audience to understand that the window for two-state solution is closing very rapidly. I mean, very rapidly if it hasn't closed down, really. And the possibility of two-state solution is becoming very, very slim with Israeli illegal annexation, with Israeli construction of settlements and so on. That's why I think the issue that has to be clear to Israelis, to Jewish people first, in Israel and outside Israel, that with the death of two-state solution, the outcome is not a system of apartheid that Palestinians will tolerate. Being slaves to occupation and apartheid is not an option for us. We will never stop struggling for our rights. And thus, to think that Palestinians will accept to live in 224 ghettos in the West Bank and one large ghetto in Gaza and accept Israel to be as an oppressive power to rule and control our life without dignity, it's not an option. We will never stop struggling to change the situation. But if the two states option is dead, the only remaining solution will be one state with total and complete equal national and civil rights. Today, the number of Palestinians on the land of historic Palestine is a little bit more than the Israeli Jewish people, or equal in the worst case scenario. So 50% of the people cannot continue to oppress and control the other 50%. This is unacceptable. So either the American administration and the whole world community will throw their power to create a two-state solution immediately with a real Palestinian and a free state, or we will end up with a long struggle to bring down apartheid in the whole of historic Palestine and to have one state solution, but with equal rights, with equal dignity, with equal respect of our human rights.
Well, we've come to the top of the hour, and I'm aware that you probably both have other things that you need to do. And so I'm going to wrap it up by beginning by saying thank you. Thank you to both of you for your tireless work for human rights, for Palestinian rights. And as Dr. Mustafa said at the beginning, the election loss was a loss for us all. I want to very quickly summarize and say that we covered so many topics in this 1 hour, everything from annexation to the recognition of Palestine, to the legal work that needs to be done, to the co-resistance, BDS, elections, and popular resistance. And I thank you both for your contributions. I also want to thank the 1,600 people who have joined in, who are watching this in this live, and of course to the people who have put this together, who I know often are nameless, but I do want to thank you very much for all of your efforts. So I will wrap up now by saying a quick thank you, and hope that we will be able to do this again. And once again, thank you both for your tireless efforts and for continuing to champion the cause of Palestinian freedom and Palestinian rights. Thank you.
Diana, thank you very much. It's
Thank
been
you.
a fascinating hour, and I'm very happy to repeat it anytime. And I want to thank Mustafa for his work, because it's done so much to educate people all over the world. I've been with him in India, speaking at a mass meeting of people who previously had been, frankly, largely unaware of the issue. And his ability to educate 100,000 people in half an hour was astonishing.
Thank you, Jeremy. You are and will remain a wonderful friend. And I'm really looking forward to having the opportunity to meet you as soon as possible with this COVID-19. It's really time for us to get together and to strategize together. But thank you for your principled position, for everything you have done. Thank you, the members of the Labor for Palestine. We really appreciate your solidarity with our people. And thank you, Diana, for the wonderful way you ran this session. And I hope to see you too as soon as possible. If I cannot come to Haifa, please come to Ramallah.
Inshallah, I will. I'll be there very soon.